History usually remembers kings for the blood they spilled on the battlefield. We glorify the warriors, the crusaders, and the conquerors who expanded empires with the edge of a sword. But in the late 15th century, a new kind of monarch emerged from the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. He was not a hero of legend, nor a charismatic tyrant. He was a man of the shadows, a man of the ledger, and a man who understood a truth that his predecessors had fatally ignored. Power is not found in the crown. Power is found in the purse. Henry VIII, the first of the Tudor line, inherited a kingdom that was effectively a failed state. England was bankrupt, fractured by decades of civil war, and ruled by a nobility that viewed the throne as a revolving door. When Henry stood on Bosworth Field in 1485, he didn't just see a country to rule, he saw a business in desperate need of a hostile takeover. This is the story of the Miser King. This is the story of how Henry VIII dismantled the power of the feudal lords, not with executions, but with audits. He didn't use the rack to break his enemies. He used the law to bankrupt them. Welcome to the birth of the modern state, built one fine, one bond, and one penny at a time. To understand Henry's obsession with money, you have to understand the wreckage he inherited. For 30 years, the houses of York and Lancaster had treated the English treasury like a personal war chest. The crown was deep in debt to foreign bankers. The royal lands had been gifted away to buy temporary loyalty, and the tax collection system was a shambles. Henry Tudor was an outsider. He had spent his youth in exile, watching from the fringes of the French and Breton courts. He saw how poverty made a prince vulnerable. He saw how the great English nobles, the kingmakers, could unmake a monarch simply by withdrawing their financial support. When he took the throne, Henry did something revolutionary. He took personal control of the accounts. While previous kings left the grubby business of money to the treasurer, Henry spent his nights hunched over his account books, personally initialing every page. He wasn't just a king, he was England's first chief financial officer. Henry's genius lay in fiscal feudalism. He realized that the medieval legal system was a goldmine of forgotten technicalities. In the 15th century, the king was the supreme landlord. Every noble held their land under certain feudal incidents. If a noble died and left an underage heir, the king took the profits of the land. Wardship. If an heir wanted to take over their estate, they had to pay the king a fee. Livery. Under previous kings, these rules were loosely enforced. Under Henry VII, they became a legal dragnet. He employed a surveyor of the king's prerogative to hunt down every missed payment and every lapsed title from the last 100 years. If your great-grandfather had failed to pay a fee to the crown in 1420, Henry's lawyers would find it in 1495, and they would charge you interest. He wasn't taxing the poor, he was squeezing the rich. He turned the nobility from a military threat into a revenue stream. But his most terrifying weapon was the bond and recognition. Henry didn't want to execute his nobles. Dead men don't pay taxes. Instead, he placed them under massive financial suspended sentences. If a lord was suspected of disloyalty, or even just being too powerful, Henry would force them to sign a bond, a legal promise to pay a staggering sum, say £10,000, if they ever broke a specific, often vague rule. By the end of his reign, 3/4 of the English nobility were under some form of financial bond to the king. It was a masterpiece of psychological and financial warfare. The nobles weren't in dungeons, they were in a virtual prison of debt. One wrong move, one whisper of rebellion, and the king could legally seize their entire family fortune. Henry didn't need a large standing army to keep the peace. He had a ledger that could ruin a dynasty in a single afternoon. To enforce this legal terror, Henry created a specialized unit, the Council Learned in the Law. This was effectively a 15th-century IRS with the power of the Star Chamber. Led by the notorious duo Empson and Dudley, this council operated outside the common law. They didn't need a jury. They didn't need a public trial. They summoned people to private hearings and extracted fines for offenses that were often entirely fabricated. They were the king's debt collectors. They became the most hated men in England, but for Henry, they were indispensable. They turned the English legal system into a sophisticated extortion racket, funneling a constant stream of gold directly into the king's private coffers, the Privy Chamber. Henry understood another vital financial truth. War is the ultimate destroyer of capital. In 1492, Henry took an army to France. To the public, it looked like he was following in the footsteps of Henry V. But Henry VII had no intention of fighting a long, bloody campaign. He simply sat outside the city of Boulogne and waited. The French king, Charles VIII, was desperate to go to war in Italy and didn't want a distraction in the north. Henry knew this. He sold his retreat for a massive price. Under the Treaty of Etaples, France agreed to pay Henry a pension of 745,000 crowns, basically a massive bribe to go home and stay there. Henry had managed the impossible. He had made a profit out of a war he never fought. He had monetized his military threat. By the time Henry VII neared his end in 1509, he had transformed the English monarchy. He had arrived with nothing. He died leaving a cash reserve of nearly £1.25 million, a fortune that made the English crown the most solvent and stable in Europe. He was the miser king, hated by the elite he had impoverished, but respected by a nation that quidcum had a decade of peace and a stable currency. He had used the law to build a fortress of gold that protected the Tudor dynasty, but as the breath left his body, the vault keys passed to his son, a young, vibrant, and incredibly reckless Prince Henry. The miser's fortune was about to meet the ultimate big spender. On April 21, 1509, the heart of the Tudor machine stopped beating. Henry VII was dead. He left behind a kingdom that was unrecognizable from the one he had seized 24 years earlier. He left a nation at peace, a nobility tamed by debt, and a treasury overflowing with the staggering sum of £1.25 million in liquid cash. In an age where kings usually died in debt to Italian bankers or their own subjects, Henry VIII died as the richest man in England, perhaps the richest in Europe. But money gathered in cold blood is rarely celebrated. As the news spread from Richmond to the streets of London, the people didn't weep. They breathed a collective sigh of relief. The legal terror was over. The auditor king was gone, and in his place stood a 17-year-old boy who looked like a sun god. But every new regime needs a sacrifice to wash away the sins of the old. To secure his popularity, the young Henry VIII was about to throw his father's most loyal servants to the wolves. Henry VIII knew that to be loved, he had to distance himself from his father's miserly reputation. The first act of his reign was a masterpiece of political theater. He ordered the arrest of Richard Empson and Edmund Dudley, the two men who had been the face of his father's fiscal extortion. They were charged with constructive treason, a legal absurdity that essentially accused them of being too good at their jobs. Henry VIII didn't care about the legality, he cared about the optics. By executing the debt collectors, he was symbolically canceling the psychological weight of his father's reign. In August 1510, their heads fell on Tower Hill. The message was clear. The era of the ledger was over. The era of the sword in the feast had begun.
But Henry VIII failed to realize that by killing the men who understood the accounts, he was destroying the very mechanism that kept the crown solvent. He was keeping the fortune, but executing the brains that built it.
To a 17-year-old with an unquenchable thirst for glory, £1.25 million felt like an infinite resource. Henry VIII had spent 24 years agonizing over every penny. Henry VIII would spend the next 24 months proving how quickly a fortune can evaporate. He immediately began a campaign of magnificence. He bought the finest horses, the most intricate armor, and commissioned palaces that made his father's Richmond look like a cottage. He doubled the size of the Royal Navy and increased the wages of the court. But the biggest strain was not the palaces, it was the phantom of the warrior king. Henry VIII wanted to be Henry V. He wanted to conquer France. He viewed his father's peace treaties not as stable revenue streams, but as humiliations to be erased. The miser's gold was about to become the warlord's fuel.
In 1513, Henry VIII invaded France. It was a logistical nightmare and a financial catastrophe. He captured a few minor towns, Terouanne and Tournai, which were strategically useless but expensive to garrison. The cost of this single campaign was nearly £1 million. In one summer of glory, Henry VIII had incinerated nearly the entire surplus his father had spent a lifetime accumulating. The carefully built pension from the Treaty of Etaples was discarded. The painless revenue of legal fines was replaced by the painful reality of direct taxation and massive loans. By 1520, at the Field of the Cloth of Gold, Henry was once again spending like a billionaire. He built a temporary palace of glass and gold cloth just to impress the French king for 2 weeks. Behind the scenes, the royal accountants were sweating. The cash was gone. The miser's fortune was a memory.
The irony of Henry VII's life is profound. He was a man who hated war because he knew it was bad for business. He used the law to create a stable, centralized state that could survive without the constant looting of neighbors. His son, Henry VIII, used that very stability to fund the most reckless period of spending in English history. Without the miser's fortune, Henry VIII could never have sustained his early wars. Without the centralized legal power his father built, Henry VIII could never have executed the dissolution of the monasteries later in his reign, his second great land grab, once the first fortune ran out. Henry VII gave the Tudor dynasty its bones. Henry VIII simply gave it the flesh, and then proceeded to starve it. We often prefer the stories of the Henry VIIIs of history, the kings of drama, wives, and war. But the Miser King offers a more uncomfortable, more relevant lesson for our modern world. Henry VII proved that a nation's true strength isn't measured by the size of its monuments or the reach of its armies, but by the integrity of its balance sheet. He was the first monarch to treat the state like a corporation, and he was the last to leave it in the black. He was the king who traded the glory of the sword for the power of the audit. And in the end, it was his gold, not his son's vanity, that ensured the Tudor name would echo through history. I'm Gavin, and this is Medieval Echoes. Subscribe to break the cycle, because history doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. If you know the pattern, you own the future.